The Book of Lamentations. It's a unique book in the Old Testament that contains 5 poems from an anonymous author who survived and is now reflecting back on the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem and the destruction and the exile that followed. Remember the whole story from the book of 2 Kings. The fall of Jerusalem and the exile was the most horrendous catastrophe in Israel's history up to this point. So remember, God had promised Abraham the land. He'd given David victory to make Jerusalem Israel's capital. And from David came the royal line of kings. You had God's presence there in the temple, and that's where the priests maintained the rituals of Israel's worship. And after 500 years of all of this history, in the summer of 587 BC, the city fell to Babylon. It was all decimated and gone. And so the Book of Lamentations is a memorial to the pain and confusion of the Israelites that followed this destruction. Now, the lament poems found here are not unique in the Bible. There's lots of them in the book of Psalms. And these biblical poems of lament, they do a number of things. They're a form of protest. They're a way of drawing everybody's attention, including God's attention, to the horrible things that happen in this world that should not be tolerated. They're a way of processing emotion. So in these poems, God's people vent their anger and dismay at the ruin caused by people's sin and selfishness. And these poems are a place to voice confusion. Suffering makes us ask questions about God's character and promises, and none of this is looked down on in the Bible. Just the opposite. These poems of lament give a sacred dignity to human suffering. And so these human words of grief that are addressed to God have now become part of God's word to his people. The design of these 5 poems is very intentional. It's part of the book's message. So chapters 1 through 4 are called acrostics, which means alphabet poems. Each poetic verse begins with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is made up of 22 letters. Now, this very ordered and linear structure, it's in stark contrast to the disorder of the pain and the confused grief that's explored in these poems. So it's like Israel's suffering is explored A to Z and is trying to express something that is inexpressible. Chapters 1 and 2 each have 1 verse per letter, giving them a really similar design, but the themes are very different. So chapter 1 focuses on the grief and shame of a figure called Lady Zion. The poet personifies the city of Jerusalem as a widow, also called the daughter of Zion. And she sits alone. She's bereaved of her loved ones, devastated. No one comes to comfort her. It's a very powerful metaphor. And then Lady Zion speaks. She calls on the Lord to notice her fate. And through this image, the poet, he's showing that the city's destruction brought a level of psychological trauma on the Israelites that can only be expressed as the experience of a funeral and the death of a loved one. Chapter 2 focuses on the fall of Jerusalem and how it was a consequence of Israel's sin and was brought about by God's wrath, which is a key word in this poem. Now, it's important to remember that in the Bible, God's wrath is not spontaneous, volatile anger. The biblical poets and prophets, they use this word to talk about God's justice. So Israel had entered a covenant agreement with God, and for centuries they've been violating it by worshiping other gods, perpetrating injustice, oppressing the poor. And so, yes, God is slow to anger, but he eventually does get angry at human evil, and he will bring his just anger in the form of punishment. In the case of Jerusalem, this involved allowing Babylon to come and conquer the city. And so this poem is acknowledging that God's wrath is justified, but this doesn't keep the poet from lamenting and asking God to show compassion once again. Chapter 3 breaks this design pattern by having 3 verses per letter, so it's the longest poem in the book. And the voice is that of a lonely man speaking out of his suffering and grief as a representative of the whole people. And what's interesting is that this chapter is full of language that's drawn from other parts of the Old Testament, from the laments of Job and from other important lament psalms, and even from the suffering servant poems in Isaiah. And the poet sees his hardship as a form of God's justice, like chapter 2 said. But paradoxically, this is what gives the poet hope. And it leads him to offer the only hopeful words in the whole book. Because of the Lord's covenant faithfulness, we do not perish. His mercies never fail. They're new every morning. How great is your faithfulness, O God. So I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance, therefore I will put my hope in him. So the poet reasons, if God is consistent enough to bring his justice on human evil, then he'll also be consistent with his covenant promise to not allow evil to get the final word. And so for this poet, God's judgment is the seedbed of hope for the future. Chapter 4 goes back to the same alphabet structure as chapters 1 and 2, and is a vivid and disturbing depiction of the 2-year siege in Jerusalem. And it contrasts how things used to be in Jerusalem of the past and how terrible they became in the siege. So children used to laugh and play in the streets, but now they beg for food. The wealthy used to eat lavish meals, but now they eat whatever they can find in the dirt. And the royal leaders used to be full of splendor, but now they're famished and dirty and unrecognizable. And the anointed king from the line of David has been captured and dragged away. So the poem's power comes from the shock of these contrasts, and it's exploring the depth of the suffering that Israel brought on itself. Now, the final poem is unique because it breaks the design pattern. It's the same length as all of the other alphabet poems, but the alphabet order is gone. It's like the poet can't hold it together anymore, and his grief has exploded back into chaos. The poem is a communal prayer for God's mercy. Israel begs God not to ignore their suffering or abandon them. And the poem offers a long list of all of the different kinds of people who were devastated by the fall of the city. They ask God not to forget these people, and they lament on behalf of others, giving voice to their pain. Suffering in silence is just not a virtue in this book. God's people are not asked to deny their emotions, but voice their protest, to vent their feelings and pour it all out before God. The book ends with something of a paradox. The poet acknowledges that God is the eternal king of the world, but also that Israel's circumstances make them feel like God is nowhere to be found. And so the final words of the book leave this tension totally unresolved. It asks, unless you've totally rejected us, and the book ends. The poet doesn't offer a nice, neat conclusion, much like our own experiences of pain and suffering. The story of the Bible doesn't end here, but this very important book shows us how lament and prayer and grief are a crucial part of the journey of faith of God's people in a broken world. And that's what the book of Lamentations is all about.
Hey, good morning, church. We are in week 2 of a series in the book of Lamentations that we are calling Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy. And it's just an opportunity for us to rediscover the spiritual practice of lament, of crying out to God. There's lots of spiritual practices that we can talk about, and one that I believe the church in America needs to rediscover is, what does it mean to cry out to God in anguish and in pain and sadness? And as we talked about last week, that sadness absolutely has a role in our spiritual formation. We may find it easier to push sadness away or to push it down or to deny it or to ignore it, but it has a role in our lives, and it can actually connect us more deeply to the heart of God. So as we get going today, I just want you to consider a couple friends who are out for a hike, and they're not like really experienced hikers, but they're making their way. They've got their water bottles and their tennis shoes, and they're walking along a path. But then they get to a place where there's a creek, and the path kind of ends. And what's going to need to happen is they're going to need to jump from the ground that they're standing on onto this boulder, this big rock, and it has some moss on it. And each individual person has to decide if they are able, if they have the physical ability to traverse that gap that exists between the ground that they're standing on and where they need to go. They need to decide, is their body going to propel them onto that rock, or are they going to fall in the water? Or I want you to think about the family that is vacationing, and mom or dad is in the driver's seat of the minivan, and they're getting closer and closer to the exit that they need to get to, and they haven't been paying super great attention. Now the exit's here, and they're in the wrong lane, and they need to make a decision, a split-second decision, to decide, do they have time? Can they close the gap between where they are and where they need to go? Or do they have to wait to the next exit? I've been guilty of that. And when we talk about lament, when we're coming around this idea of expressing our grief and our sadness, our preoccupation and our worry, I think to express lament is to wrestle with the gap The gap that exists between the promises of God and who he has promised to be, his faithfulness, his goodness, his power, his provision, his love, and our current suffering, like our current circumstance. And what lament does, lament gives us a word to speak into that wrestling, into that space, into that gap between what God has promised and what is taking up space in our heart. There's this great book by this man, Nicholas Walterstorff, and it's called A Lament for the Son. And in it, he has this really, really powerful line where he just says that perhaps I shall see things that dry-eyed I could not see. Perhaps through lament, through the process of expressing one's grief and anguish before God, I shall see things that dry-eyed I could not see. And so the anatomy of Lamentations, let's talk a little bit about how it actually looks and what's going on in the book. Chapters 1 and 2 are written in kind of a cool way. They're written in an acrostic. And so what that means is that the first letter of every verse is a successive letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And you might think like, well, like what's up with that? Why is that? Here's a picture that kind of shows what we're talking about. And so the Hebrew letters, you can kind of see, just so you know, we're reading from right to left, so don't get confused by that. But the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph and Bet and Gimel and Dalet, that's kind of like A, B, C, and D. So you can kind of tell each of those letters are highlighted, and it just kind of shows the comprehensive nature of the suffering of Israel. Like the total destruction that they're experiencing. Like there is suffering, there's destruction, there's pain, there's anguish, there's grief, there's turmoil, like from A to Z. And Jeremiah wants us to see that, wants us to notice that, wants us to pay attention to the fact that everything is completely and utterly destroyed. And so I want to read this morning, we're going to read the first 11 verses in the book of Lamentations. So if you have a Bible, go ahead and grab that, or pull out your phone or whatever device you have. We also are going to put it up on the screen too for you to see, but can't encourage you enough to grab something that you can follow along. I'm going to read out of the NIV 84, and we find these words. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people, how like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations, she who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night, tears are upon her cheeks among all her lovers. There is none to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her, they've become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to her appointed feasts. All her gateways are desolate. Her priests groan, her maidens grieve, and she is in bitter anguish. Her foes have become her masters. Her enemies are at ease. The Lord has brought her grief because of her many sins. Her children have gone into exile, captive before the foe. All the splendor has departed from the daughter of Zion. Her princes are like deer that find no pasture. In weakness they have fled before the pursuer. In the days of her affliction and wandering, Jerusalem remembers all the treasures that were hers in the days of old. When her people fell into enemy hands, there was no one to help her. Her enemies looked at her and laughed at her destruction. Jerusalem has sinned greatly and so has become unclean. All who honor her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns away. Her filthiness clung to her skirts. She did not consider the future. Her fall was astounding. There was none to comfort her. Look, O Lord, on my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. The enemy laid hands on all her treasures. She saw pagan nations enter her sanctuary, those you had forbidden to enter your assembly. All her people groan as they search for bread. They barter their treasures for food to keep themselves alive. Look, O Lord, and consider, for I am despised. So in this first chapter of the book of Lamentations, it's kind of a chapter of reversals. And there's a few different reversals that I want you to notice, that I want you to pay attention to, that I don't want you to miss. Number one is a reversal of status. Like the city it's a shadow of its former self. Like it's unrecognizable. Like once it was full of people, and now what's said about it? It says that it's a widow. Like it once was a queen, and now it's a slave. There was a day when Jerusalem was high and mighty and powerful, and it prospered. It had a powerful wall that was built around the city that would protect the city from invaders and from capture and from harm. And it would be filled with people, and all of those people are gone. And almost the days of old, it's even hard to remember now how great it was because of how dark it is now. 1 Kings chapter 10, I want to kind of show you that. It will kind of describe some of the history, what things used to be like in Jerusalem. So this is 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 23. King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all of the other kings of the earth. So he's greater in riches and in wisdom than all of the other kings ever. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart year after year. Everyone who came brought a gift. Articles of silver and gold, robes and weapons and spices and horses and mules. In the ancient world, that's all like really amazing stuff. We kind of read it and we're like, so that's all a really big deal in the ancient world. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots. Just like think about that for a minute. Not sure why a person would need 1,400 chariots. And 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king, check this out, the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore trees in the foothills. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt because the horses that were there weren't good enough. So he had to bring them in from Egypt and from Q. The royal merchants purchased them from Q. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and of the Arameans. Like all of this to say, Jerusalem looks nothing like it used to. And even worse than that, the people who inhabited Jerusalem, there has been a great reversal of their status. You know, there's this movie that we talked about last weekend, this movie Cars, you know, Lightning McQueen, and my personal favorite character in the movie, Tow Mater. He's my favorite. He kind of gets forgotten about, but I think he has an amazing spirit about him. And kind of the premise of the first movie is there's this town called Radiator Springs. And Radiator Springs used to be like the place to go. It was this town off Route 66. And so lots of people would stop by and they would enjoy a meal at restaurants and they would buy things in the shops. And it was just a city of hustle and bustle. But now it's desolate and it's not that way anymore. And the only reason why Lightning McQueen finds it is because he's lost and he's driving in the middle of nowhere, and he comes upon this city, this town that had amazing days, but all of the amazing days are in the past. This is Jerusalem. There has been a great reversal of status. So that's number one. Number two, there has been a great reversal of expectations. Like it says that in Lamentations chapter 1 that the lovers of Jerusalem, the people that protected them and cared for them, they have deserted her. Like they've walked away from her. We find this in Jeremiah chapter 37. We find these words. Then the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Tell the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of me, Pharaoh's army, which has marched out to support you, will go back to its own land, to Egypt. Then the Babylonians will return and attack the city. They will capture it and burn it down. So there's been a reversal of status. There's been a reversal of expectations, that they don't have these nations looking out for them. Like now they're alone, they're desolate, they're isolated. And then there's a third reversal, the reversal of history. You know, verse 3 says, after affliction and harsh labor, she has gone into exile. Like, church, this is exile language. This is Exodus language. Like, you can't read the words affliction and harsh labor and not think of their slavery in Egypt, and not think of the Hebrew people, the Israelite people, about making bricks for Pharaoh day in and day out, breaking their backs so that Pharaoh would have one more building to show his power and his might and his rule in the earth. So this is a reversal of status, it's a reversal of expectations, and it's a reversal of history. Verse 4 says that the roads even mourn. There's no more traffic. Like, nobody's coming into Jerusalem. No one's pouring into the city to celebrate the feasts anymore. Like, there's no music. There's no laughter. Like, nobody's gathering at the temple. And the priests are groaning because there's no sacrifices to participate in. And the maidens, these young women, they're grieving because all that they had hoped for in having a family and a husband and living in the footsteps and the legacy of their mothers and grandmothers who had gone before them. Like, now they're in exile. Now they have been torn away from the city that they love. And so even the roads express their grief. And the priests groan in pain, and the maidens weep because of the desolation that has come on this city. And then verse 6, it says that the princes of Jerusalem are like deer with no pasture. In weakness they have fled before the pursuer. And they're talking about, this is an allusion to this King Zedekiah and all of his soldiers. This in Jeremiah chapter 39. When Babylon comes to take siege of the city, instead of standing their ground, instead of believing that maybe God would deliver them, they run away, they flee in fear. And then verse 7, you know, Jerusalem's remembering what things used to be like. Like, it's remembering its past glory, its past honor, but it's also feeling its present suffering. Remembering its treasures in the days of old, and when her people fell, like there was no one to help her. And even worse than having no one available to help her, that people laughed at her. I want you to think of a time in your life when someone has laughed at you, and it's not been because you've said something funny, that you've done something embarrassing. I want you to think about that feeling that takes root in your heart, that feeling of shame and not being enough and not measuring up. This is what the whole nation of Israel feels. And it tells us something. It tells us that affluence, and it tells us that power and popularity and position and honor, all of those things have removable legs. Like, those things will not stand forever, because there was a day when Israel had all of that. It had honor, it had popularity, it had wealth, it had prestige. And now it has nothing. It's a shadow, it's a shell of its former self. And Proverbs 16:18 says this, that pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. This proverb always makes me laugh a little bit because when I was a youth pastor, we would talk about this proverb, and I had to explain haughty because for a lot of teenagers, they have a different context for a haughty spirit as like an attractive spirit, someone who looks beautiful or handsome. And so it always makes me laugh. But a haughty spirit, it just means prideful. It means secure. It means sure of oneself. And it's funny right now because I can even just see the faces of those teenagers that would always bring that up. So it's just a good memory for me. But pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit, a confident spirit before the fall. And you know, we have a lot of stories, and in a lot of ways, our culture loves stories where there has been a fall. Like someone has been in high position, and then there's a moment when the bottom falls out and there's a fall. On ESPN right now, they did a documentary on Lance Armstrong, and this amazing cyclist who won like 6 Tour de France's in a row. And if you don't know anything about the Tour de France, it's like doing a marathon every day. You ride your bike like thousands of miles all over France. It's amazing to watch, but I have no desire to participate in something like that. But we found out later, after he won all these Tour de France's, that he cheated. Well, it turns out everybody else was cheating too. And we live in this culture where if you do something wrong like that, we often celebrate the fall. Or if you're a little bit older, maybe you can think about Pete Rose and his fall out of baseball for cheating. And this nation has had a fall. Every single person who used to reside in Judah, in Jerusalem, no longer lives there. Everything was left behind. And now they're back in exile. They're back in the place where their ancestors were separated from the land that God had promised to give them, from the promises he has spoken over them. And their souls are crushed, and their hearts are heavy. Verse 8, we find out why this is all happening, that Judah, the people of God, have sinned greatly. And sin, the Hebrew word in this passage for sin is this word pisah, which means like covenant rebellion. Like there's a promise that Israel made to God, and a promise that God made to Israel. Like, I will be your God and you will be my people. And it's not really like this is what you're going to do, but it's more like these are the kinds of people that you are going to be. You're going to love me. You're going to honor me. You're going to follow me. You're going to worship me. And Israel doesn't do that. Israel gets sucked into the culture around him and what other nations are doing and who other nations are worshiping and what other nations are valuing. I just wonder if any of this sounds familiar to us. Like, this is our battle in our day. It's to love God, to honor God, to worship God, and not get sucked in by all of the messages around us, all of the ways that we are getting pulled away from our first love. Israel does this. And the destruction comes because of Israel's sin, their covenant rebellion against God. So the suffering of Israel is unbearable, but it's not innocent. Like, they're guilty of this. Like, they're guilty of walking away from God long before Judah, Jerusalem, is burned to the ground and the city that they loved is no more. So I got this question this week in an email from somebody in our community, and they just asked, okay, lament, that's great. I'm looking forward to what you have to say about Lamentations, a book I've never read. But then the question at the bottom of the email was like, tell me the difference between the book of Job, which we usually use to talk about lament, and Lamentations. Like, is there a difference, and what's the difference? And awesome question, amazing. But the difference is Job is a book that talks about innocent suffering. So Job is this righteous man. He's an honorable man. He's a worshiper of God. And calamity and darkness and pain and anguish and suffering falls on him. And he loses everything that he's ever known. But the only thing that he doesn't lose is his confidence in who God is and who God has made him to be. So his circumstances have been burned to the ground and destroyed. but he has in his integrity at the end, because he understands that integrity is the only thing that nobody else can take from you. Integrity is what you give away. But that's Job. But Lamentations, this is deserved suffering. Like, they've walked away from God, and they had Jeremiah, book of Jeremiah is full of all of the warnings of the prophets to turn away from the idols, turn back toward God, or calamity, destruction is coming on you, and they don't listen. And turns out Jeremiah was right, because now they're in exile. And I just don't believe that probably every single person in Jerusalem is guilty. I think there's probably some people who were praying for revival. I think there's probably some people who were seeking to honor God, who were trying to live out what his heart is, and they've been putting their feet, their hands, their mouth to being a kingdom person. And I think sometimes some of our suffering comes from what other people have done and what other people have spoken, the evil that has been done in our own lives. I think sometimes the wounds that we carry testify to not just our own actions. The wounds that we carry also testify to the actions of others. Like, that's how deep and wide sin is. That the wounds, the pain, the suffering, they testify to what we've done, but they also testify to what other people have done. And then thirdly, what our response is to what we have done and what other people have done. And I think probably most of us get most tangled up in the response to evil, the response to sin, the response to brokenness, both what we have done and what other people have done. In the verse 9, her filthiness was part of her outfit. She didn't consider her future. Her fall was astounding, and nobody could have ever dreamed. Nobody could have ever thought that this city could fall. Okay, so 1980, right? There's this amazing thing that happens in our world. I wasn't alive quite yet, and so I've had to watch the movie of the miracle on ice between the U.S. hockey team and the Russian hockey team. I brought my hockey jersey this morning. I'm a big Pittsburgh Penguins fan, so if you need a team to cheer for, they're not playing right now, but hopefully someday they will. Big Penguins fan. We cheer for the Penguins in our house. But the most popular, the most powerful, the most talented team in the world was the USSR Russian men's hockey team. They had this incredible goalie. I'll show a picture of him right now, and his name was Vladislav Tretiak. And don't let the smile fool you. He was a force. It was an amazing feat to score even one goal on Vladislav Tretiak. And about 12 days before the Olympics started, the U.S. men's team, which was like made up of college students, like these were not professional hockey players. These were 18, 19, 20-year-old kids. They played against the Russian Federation in an exhibition game before the Olympics at Lake Placid, and they lost 10-3. And it was like 4-0 in the first period. And if you're not really into hockey, losing 10-3 is horrible. It's like giving up 10 goals is like giving up 50 or 60 points at a football game. Like, this is really hard to come back from. And I don't know what was going on in their minds and their hearts as they, in the days leading up to the Olympics. But then the US team meets the Russians again in the Olympics. This is an exhibition this time. Like, this is the real deal. This really counts. And it was a crazy game. You had Vladislav Tretiak, the best goalie in the world, going up against this guy named Jim Craig, who is not a professional hockey player. And what's amazing about the game, what happens is The Russian Federation had like 39 shots against the US goalie, and the US had like 19 shots the entire game. And the US ends up winning 4-3, and Vladislav Tretiak gets benched after the first period because the Russian coach is so upset with him. So the Russian Federation shoots it like 39 times, US shoots it like 19 times. And that's what that means, is that's basically, you need to understand, that's like 75% of the game, 75% of the match is taking place in front of the US net. It's like shot after shot after shot after shot after shot. And I just think there's a lot of shots coming at our net in these days. But then at the end of this game, there's this incredible call by Al Michaels, and he says, "Do you believe in miracles?" And I wish I could show you the clip. I wish I could play the audio, but we're streaming live on Facebook and they would shut it down in a hurry, so I can't do that. But it's one of the most iconic sports moments we've ever had. But nobody thought that this US team ever had a chance at taking down the Russian Federation, but they win, and then they win one more game after that and they get the gold medal. But I want to talk about that today just so that you understand like how deep and how dark and how unlikely the fall of Jerusalem was. Like nobody thought this could ever happen. And it just shows the depth and the breadth and the power and the destruction of sin and of brokenness and our need for someone to repair and to restore and to redeem. So going forward, cries out, "Lord, look, O Lord, on my affliction, for the enemy had triumphed." So it wasn't just that I'm in suffering. It wasn't just that I'm in pain. Like, look on my affliction, like the enemy, the people who do not belong to you, like the people who are on the outside, like they have triumphed. Like you promised to be our God, and you've allowed these people to triumph over us. Verse 10, "The enemy has laid hands on all of our treasures." Like everything that was precious to Israel, this is probably all the stuff that they had in the temple. And they defiled the temple, the Babylonians did, by going inside the temple to steal everything and to burn it all down. And it's just been removed. All of these things that were there in times of worship and of prayer and of honor to God, they're all gone. It's like someone coming into your house and just taking everything valuable. And then verse 11, "They searched for bread, and they bartered their treasures to keep themselves alive." And this is the opposite of what happens with the Exodus generation. That they're given food by God. They are kept alive by God. And here they're trying to be their own provider to keep themselves alive. And then this powerful line at the end, "Look, O Lord, and consider, for I am despised." So asking twice for the Lord to look upon them. "Look, O Lord, on my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. And look, O Lord, and consider, for I am despised." I'm rejected. I'm alone. I'm dirty. I'm full of shame. And Lamentations, I think, invites us to cry out, asking God to see our condition. And this is the opposite of what happens to Adam and Eve in the garden, right? Like they have a condition, they have suffering, they have sin, they have gone against what God has asked of them. And they hide. They cover up. God has to say, "Adam, where are you?" Because they're hiding from God. And this is a new opportunity for the whole nation of Israel to say, "God, like, look on us, look at our affliction, look at our brokenness, look how I am despised." It's inviting God to see. And so I just want to ask you this morning, as we come to an end of week 2, like, what do you need to invite God to see? Like there's these 2 Psalms that I love reading back to back. It's Psalm 51 and Psalm 139. They're both written by David. And in Psalm 51, he says, like, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Like, don't cast your presence away from me. Don't run away from me. Like, would you see me? Would you see all that there is to see? Like, I need a new heart, a new spirit. Like, I need some reconstruction in my soul. And I understand that you are the only God that can bring that about. So would you do that? And then Psalm 139. Search me, O God, and know my heart. So create in me a clean heart, O God. And then, like, would you search me? Like, would you see if there's an offensive way in me and lead me into life everlasting? And I think this is a dark chapter in the scriptures. Like, it's painful to read. It's painful to consider. There's sadness. There's tears on every page. But there's also an invitation. There's also an opportunity to invite God to see, like, what's really true. Like, instead of hiding what's really true, instead of hiding what's going on, instead of hiding the sin and the brokenness and the need from God, I think a lot of us are built to hide our needs from each other and to hide our needs from God. This is an invitation and an opportunity before us, church. Like, oh God, would you create in me a new heart? Like, would you search me? Like, would you look on me in my affliction? Would you look on me, for I am despised? And so I just want to invite you, just in these moments, even now, like, would you consider, like, what is the way in which you need the eyes of God to see deeply into your soul, into your life, into your heart? Like, what do you need God to notice? What do you need God to see? Because you have a choice. You can run from him. You can hide from him. You can try to hide the thing that you don't want anyone to know about, the thing that you're not proud of. But when you do that, like, we miss the healing. We miss the grace. We miss the reconstructive work of the Spirit of God in our lives. So I just want to ask again as we end, like, what do you need God to see? And are you going to follow the example of the city of Judah that cries out to God to witness and to see the affliction? Or are you going to follow the example of people throughout history who have run and hid from their healer, who have run and hid from their Redeemer, who have run and hid from their Savior? Let's pray. Well, Lord God, I thank you so much for your word, the power of it, the way that it speaks to us. God, I pray for the person who's listening to this even right now, and it's just time for honesty. It's time for clarity. It's time for renewal. And it's something that they have been running from for a long time. God, we ask for your healing. We ask for your forgiveness. We ask for your mercy. As we look at this story about a city that's destroyed, we know, God, that we have also experienced lives and souls and hearts that have been destroyed by the darkness and the brokenness of the message of the evil one and the sin that has invaded our hearts and our lives. But God, we know that you're the Savior. We know that you're the healer. And so, God, we look to you and we invite you. Would you search us? Would you know us? And would you create in us a clean heart, a heart that would beat after yours? In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Grace and peace.